Sometimes the biggest gambles in life cost us almost nothing but change us forever. When Sylvia Dornan placed a single dollar on an abandoned mansion, everyone else was too afraid to touch. She wasn't looking for wealth. She was looking for a place to finally belong. The old house on the ridge had stood empty for 40 years. 4 families owned it before her. None stayed more than a season. People said it was cursed, that something dark lived in those walls. But Sylvia had survived harder things than ghost stories. The day she walked through that door, she found a hidden vault behind the kitchen wall. Inside were gold coins, old documents, and secrets that had been buried for decades. What was this house hiding? And why did every owner before her disappear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of the auction, Sylvia Dornan woke before dawn in her cabin 12 miles outside of town. The place was small, just one room with a wood stove, a narrow bed, and a table she'd built herself from salvaged pine. Through the single window, she could see the first grey light touching the peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. She'd lived here for 5 years, ever since her father died in the logging accident that took 3 men and left the whole valley in mourning. She dressed in her good jeans, the ones without patches, and a flannel shirt she'd ironed the night before. Her hands were calloused from years of carpentry work, equipment repair, and whatever other jobs she could pick up in the small Montana communities scattered through these mountains. At 36, she'd learned to be useful in the ways that mattered out here. She could fix an engine, patch a roof, and read the weather in the color of the morning sky. On the table sat her father's compass, the brass casing tarnished, but the needle still true. He'd carried it every day of his working life, first in the Marines, then in the timber crews. A compass only works if you're willing to follow it, he used to say, even when the path is hard. She slipped it into her jacket pocket, feeling its familiar weight settle against her ribs. The drive into town took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads. Sylvia passed ranches where cattle grazed in morning mist, old mining roads that led nowhere anymore, and the burned-out shell of the sawmill that had closed the year before, taking 30 jobs with it. The valley had seen better days. Most young people left for Missoula or farther, chasing work that didn't break your back or your spirit. The ones who stayed were either too stubborn or too rooted to leave. She was both. The county courthouse sat in the center of town, a brick building from 1907 with tall windows and a copper roof gone green with age. A small crowd had gathered on the steps, maybe 20 people, most of them there for the spectacle rather than any serious intention to bid. Sylvia recognized faces. The Brennan brothers who ran the feed store, old Mrs. Kowalski from the library, a handful of younger folks she knew from the hardware store or the diner. She climbed the steps slowly, aware of eyes following her. People knew why she was here. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially when that word involved the Whitlock mansion. Inside, the auction room smelled of old wood and floor wax. Folding chairs had been set up in rows, most of them empty. At the front, a county auctioneer named Harold Vance shuffled papers on a podium. He was a thin man with silver hair and reading glasses that perpetually slid down his nose. Sylvia took a seat in the 3rd row. A moment later, someone settled into the chair beside her. Didn't think you'd actually show up. She turned to find Vernon Kemp, the owner of Kemp's Hardware on Main Street. He was 72, but still strong, with weathered hands and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He'd known her father, had given Sylvia her first paying job when she was 16, sweeping floors and stocking shelves. "Said I would," Sylvia replied quietly. Vernon studied her for a moment. "You know what you're getting into with that place. An old house that needs work. It's more than that." His voice dropped lower. 4 families have owned it since 1955. None of them lasted. The Hendersons made it 8 months. The Pratts, maybe 5. The others didn't even unpack before they left. "I'm not afraid of hard work. It's not the work that drove them off." Vernon leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. "There's something wrong with that house, Sylvia. Something that gets into people's heads. I'm not talking about ghosts or superstition. I'm talking about a feeling, a wrongness. Before she could respond, the auctioneer cleared his throat and began speaking. The preliminaries were brief. Property description, legal disclaimers, condition as is. Harold Vance's voice droned through the details with the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. The property known as the Whitlock Estate, located at 1847 Ridge Road, consisting of the main house, approximately 6,800 square feet, and surrounding land totaling 14 acres. Built in 1889, vacant since 1995, significant structural concerns. Sold as is with no warranties or representations regarding habitability, he paused, looking out at the sparse crowd over his sliding glasses. Bidding starts at $1. Silence filled the room. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. Sylvia raised her hand. $1. Harold nodded, unsurprised. We have $1. Do I hear two? More silence. A few people turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from pity to amusement. No one else raised a hand. Going once at $1, Harold's gavel hovered. Going twice, another pause. Sold to bidder number 12 for $1. Just like that, it was done. Afterward, Sylvia stood in line at the county clerk's office to complete the paperwork. The woman behind the counter was Lily Chen, maybe 45, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun and a nameplate that read, Deputy Clerk. You're taking on quite a project, Lily said as she processed the deed transfer. Her tone was neutral, but something in her eyes suggested concern. I've handled projects before, not like this one. Lily glanced around, then leaned forward slightly. My grandmother worked for the Whitlocks back in the 30s. She used to tell stories about that house. Said it was built on suffering, and suffering has a way of soaking into the bones of a place. Sylvia met her gaze. Every old house has stories, true enough. Lily stamped the final document and slid it across the counter. But most of them don't have 4 families running away in the middle of the night. Just be careful up there. And if you find anything strange, anything that doesn't feel right, you come talk to me. All right? All right? Outside, Vernon was waiting by his truck, a battered Ford that was older than Sylvia. He'd parked in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and autumn leaves drifted down around him like lazy snow. Need a ride up there? He asked. I've got my truck. I know, but I'd feel better taking a look at the place with you. First time in, you should have someone along. Just in case. Sylvia considered this. Vernon wasn't the kind of man who offered help lightly, and he wasn't prone to dramatics. If he thought she needed company, there was probably a good reason. All right, she agreed. Follow me up? The drive took 20 minutes, climbing steadily into the foothills. The road narrowed and the pavement gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their shadows deep and cool. Finally, they rounded a bend, and the mansion came into view. It sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, 3 stories of Victorian architecture that might have been grand once, but now looked wounded. The wood siding had weathered to grey, and paint peeled in long strips like old skin. Windows stared blankly, several broken, others so dirty they were opaque. Ivy had claimed the east wall, climbing all the way to the roof, where several shingles had come loose and lay scattered in the overgrown yard. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, rusted and leaning in places. The gate hung crooked on its hinges, frozen half open. Sylvia parked her truck, a '98 Chevy with 190,000 miles, and climbed out slowly. The air smelled different up here. Pine and earth, yes, but underneath something older. Decay, maybe. Or just the accumulated stillness of a place left alone too long. Vernon joined her at the gate. Together, they stood looking at the house. Harrison Whitlock built this in 1889, Vernon said quietly. Copper money. He was one of the richest men in Montana for a while. Owned mines, timberland, half the businesses in town. People either worked for him or depended on someone who did. What happened to him? Disappeared in 1923. Just vanished one night. Some folks said he ran off to avoid some kind of trouble. Others thought he was killed. His son disappeared around the same time. After that, the house passed through different hands, distant relatives, business partners, eventually the bank. But nobody ever stayed. They walked up the path toward the front porch. Weeds had broken through the flagstones, and the porch steps groaned under their weight. The front door was solid oak, swollen from moisture and age. Sylvia inserted the key Lily Chen had given her. It turned with difficulty, and the door swung inward with a sound like a sigh. The interior was dim despite the afternoon light. Dust hung thick in the air, visible in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the dirty windows. The entry hall was broad, with a staircase rising to the second floor. To the left, a parlor filled with furniture draped in rotting sheets. To the right, what looked like a library, its shelves empty except for a few forgotten books. Everything smelled of mildew and time. They moved through the first floor slowly, Vernon pointing out details. The marble fireplace in the parlor, the coffered ceiling in the dining room, the butler's pantry with its rows of empty cabinets. The kitchen was large and old-fashioned, with a cast-iron stove and a porcelain sink stained brown. "It's a good house under all this neglect," Vernon said. "Good bones. If you're serious about fixing it up, it could be something again." Sylvia ran her hand along the kitchen counter. The wood was solid beneath the grime. "I'm serious. Then you'll need supplies. I'll give you a contractor's discount at the store. And I know a few people who might be willing to help with the heavy work for reasonable rates. Why are you helping me?" Vernon was quiet for a moment, looking around the dusty kitchen. "Your father was a good man, one of the best I've known. He would have wanted someone looking out for you." He paused. "And maybe because this house has been a wound in this valley for too long. If you can heal it, turn it into something good that would mean something." They explored the upper floors before Vernon left. The second floor held 6 bedrooms, all empty except for the occasional piece of abandoned furniture. The third floor was smaller, 2 rooms and an attic access. Everything was in various states of disrepair, but nothing seemed beyond fixing. It would take time and money and hard work, but Sylvia had all 3, or at least she had the time and the willingness to work. After Vernon drove away, Sylvia stood alone in the entry hall. The house settled around her with small sounds. Wood expanding, a loose shutter tapping somewhere, the whisper of wind through broken seals. It wasn't peaceful, exactly, but it wasn't threatening either. Just empty, waiting. She thought about Lily Chen's warning, about Vernon's concern, about the 4 families who'd fled this place. Part of her wondered if she was being foolish. But a larger part, the part that had been living alone in a one-room cabin for 5 years, working jobs that led nowhere, feeling like she was slowly disappearing into the mountains, that part saw possibility here, a place to finally belong. She pulled her father's compass from her pocket and opened it. The needle swung north, steady and certain. She'd followed it this far. Might as well keep going. That night she slept in the mansion for the first time. She'd brought a sleeping bag, a camp stove, and enough supplies to last a few days. The bedroom she chose was on the 2nd floor, facing east so she'd wake with the sun. She swept the floor clean, opened the window to air out the mustiness, and laid out her sleeping bag on the bare boards. As darkness fell, the house grew loud with the sounds of an old building at night. Creaks and groans, small skitterings that might have been mice, the occasional bang of a loose shutter. Sylvia lay awake for a long time, listening. The mountain wind moved through the eaves like breathing, but she wasn't afraid. She'd spent enough nights alone to know the difference between danger and simple solitude. This was just a house, old, neglected, full of history. Nothing more. Eventually she slept, and in the morning, when she woke to sunlight streaming through the dirty window, the first thing she saw was her father's compass on the floor beside her sleeping bag. Its brass casing caught the light and gleamed like a promise. The discovery came on her 3rd morning in the house. Sylvia had begun a methodical inventory of each room, taking notes on what needed immediate attention and what could wait. The roof leaked in 2 places. Several windows needed replacing. The plumbing was questionable at best, but the foundation appeared solid and the basic structure was sound. It would take months of work, but it was doable. She was in the kitchen examining the ancient stove when she noticed something odd about the wall behind it. The vertical boards didn't quite line up with the rest of the room. She ran her hand along the seam, feeling for there, a slight gap, barely wider than a fingernail. She found a butter knife in one of the drawers and worked it into the gap. With steady pressure, a panel of boards swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark space behind the wall. Sylvia's heart quickened. She retrieved her flashlight and aimed it into the opening. A vault, small, maybe 3 feet square, built into the wall cavity. Inside sat several cloth bags, their fabric deteriorated but still intact. Beside them, a leather-bound book and a bundle of yellowed papers tied with string. She reached in carefully and pulled out one of the bags. The fabric disintegrated at her touch, spilling gold coins across the kitchen floor. They rang against the wood with a sound like bells. Liberty Head eagles, Morgan silver dollars, coins she recognized from her father's occasional coin-collecting catalogues. Most were dated between 1880 and 1920. There were 6 bags in total. She emptied them one by one, counting. Hundreds of coins. Possibly thousands of dollars in gold and silver, even at face value. At collector's prices, maybe tens of thousands. But it was the ledger that made her hands shake. She carried it to the kitchen table, careful with its deteriorating binding, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. Columns of dates, initials, amounts. Page after page of entries, running from 1891 through 1923. At first, she couldn't make sense of it. Then a pattern emerged. Names, or rather initials, appeared repeatedly alongside dollar amounts and cryptic notations. SB, $500, timber rights. HK, $300, election. RV, $200, incident resolved. She flipped through slowly, her historian's training kicking in. This was a record of transactions, but not legitimate business. These were payments made in secret, recorded in code. Then she saw a full name, and her breath caught. J. Dornan, August 1919. $800. Silence regarding mine collapse. Dornan. Her family name. Her grandfather's generation. She sat back, staring at the entry. Her grandfather had been involved with Harrison Whitlock, had taken money for silence about a mine collapse. She knew her grandfather had worked in the mines before moving to timber, but her father never spoke much about those years. Sylvia continued reading. The entries grew darker as the years progressed. More payments for silence, for cooperation, for resolution of problems, and the amounts increased. Thousands of dollars changing hands, recorded in this meticulous, damning ledger. The final entries were dated November 1923. Then, nothing. The rest of the pages were blank. She found a photograph tucked between the last filled page and the first blank one. It showed a group of men standing in front of the mansion. Maybe 10 of them, dressed in suits, stern-faced. One man stood in the center, taller than the others, with a thick mustache and eyes that even in the faded photograph seemed cold. Harrison Whitlock. She recognized him from a portrait that still hung in the county courthouse. The bundled papers were deeds, contracts, and legal documents. Property transfers, mining claims, timber rights, all signed by various parties, all seemingly legitimate. But when compared with the ledger entries, the pattern became clear. These weren't honest transactions. They were the results of bribes, coercion, or worse. Sylvia spent the rest of the morning studying the contents of the vault. The more she read, the clearer the picture became. Harrison Whitlock hadn't just been a successful businessman. He'd built his empire on corruption, buying off officials, silencing critics, and eliminating obstacles. The copper wealth that built this mansion had come at a terrible cost, and her own grandfather had been part of it. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when she heard a truck engine outside. Through the window, she saw Vernon's Ford pulling up the drive. He found her in the kitchen, surrounded by gold coins and old papers. "Well," he said quietly, taking in the scene. "That explains a few things." Sylvia showed him the coins but kept the ledger to herself for now. Some instinct told her to be cautious about who saw it, at least until she understood what she was dealing with. Vernon whistled low. "That's a fortune. Even for 1923, this would have been serious money." He picked up one of the coins, examining it in the light. "You need to be careful with this, Sylvia. Word gets out you found a cache like this, you'll have all kinds of trouble. I know, he set the coin down carefully. You should talk to a lawyer. Make sure everything's legal regarding ownership. And maybe keep this to yourself for now. After Vernon left, promising to return the next day with some supplies, Sylvia returned to the ledger. She needed to understand what she'd found, what it meant. The names, the initials, some of them were familiar. She'd seen them around town, on businesses, on street signs. That evening, she made a decision. She would research this properly, find out what Harrison Whitlock had really done, what had happened to him and his son. The mansion's history was darker than anyone had told her, and if she was going to live here, she needed to know the truth. But as night fell and the house settled around her, something felt different. The sounds weren't just the normal creaking of old wood anymore. There were footsteps above her, slow, deliberate, crossing the second-floor hallway. She was on the first floor, alone in the house. Sylvia grabbed her flashlight and climbed the stairs. The second-floor hallway was empty, lit only by moonlight through the dirty windows. The footsteps had stopped. She checked each bedroom, all empty, all exactly as she'd left them that morning. Back downstairs, she sat in the kitchen with the ledger open before her. The house was silent now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The discovery of the vault had disturbed something. Or maybe it was just her own unease, knowing what she now knew about this place. She thought about the 4 families who'd left. Had they found something too? Had they discovered evidence of what Whitlock had done? Or had they simply felt what she was feeling now, that the mansion held more than just old walls and empty rooms? A door slammed upstairs. Sylvia jumped, her heart hammering. Then another door and another in rapid succession. She stood, flashlight in hand, listening. The sounds stopped as abruptly as they'd started. For a long moment, she stood frozen in the kitchen. Then she made herself move, climbing the stairs again, checking each room. All the doors were closed now, but she'd left them open. She knew she had. She opened the first bedroom door. Empty. The second. Empty. The third. She stopped. In the middle of the floor lay a small object that hadn't been there before. She knelt and picked it up. A metal badge, tarnished and old. She wiped away the grime and read the stamped numbers. 247. It looked like a worker's identification badge, the kind mines used to track their employees. But what was it doing here, in an abandoned bedroom in Harrison Whitlock's mansion? Sylvia slipped the badge into her pocket alongside her father's compass. Questions were multiplying faster than answers. The gold coins were just the beginning. This house held deeper secrets, darker truths, and she was starting to realize that discovering them might be more dangerous than she'd imagined. That night, she didn't sleep well. She kept the ledger hidden under her sleeping bag, the coins secured in her truck, and her father's hunting rifle within reach. The house made its night sounds, creaks, groans, the whisper of wind through gaps and cracks. But now every sound seemed like a warning. By morning, she'd made another decision. She would find out what happened in this house. She would trace every entry in that ledger, every name, every dark transaction. Harrison Whitlock had built an empire on suffering, and somehow, impossibly, her own family had been tangled up in it. The mansion wasn't just her home now. It was a mystery she had to solve, and a wrong she might finally be able to set right. 3 days later, Sylvia was on her hands and knees in the library when she found the surveyor's map. She'd been removing the baseboards. They were rotted through in places and needed replacing, when one section came away to reveal a narrow gap behind it. Rolled tight and wedged into the wall cavity was a cylinder of aged paper, brittle at the edges, but remarkably preserved. She carried it to the dining room table and unrolled it carefully, weighing down the corners with books. It was a hand-drawn architectural plan, dated 1891, showing the mansion's layout in meticulous detail. Every room, every door, every window was marked. But as she compared the map to her own observations of the house, discrepancies emerged. The map showed rooms that didn't exist, a chamber off the north wing where she'd found only a solid wall, a space beneath the main staircase that should have been accessible but wasn't, and in the basement level, which she hadn't fully explored yet. Several rooms were marked with Notations she couldn't quite decipher. One marking caught her attention. Cold room, north wing, below. The handwriting was precise, and beside it someone had drawn a small symbol that looked like a warning. She needed more information. The Historical Society might have records, newspaper archives, something that could help her understand what she'd found. The Bitterroot Valley Historical Society occupied a small building on Elm Street, a former bank converted into a repository for the region's collective memory. Sylvia pushed through the heavy door into a space that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Behind the desk sat a woman Sylvia recognized from around town, Patricia Voss, maybe 67, with steel grey hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "Help you?" Patricia asked, looking up from a ledger she was annotating. "I'm researching the Whitlock mansion." "I just bought it." Patricia's expression shifted, surprise, then concern, then something harder to read. "I heard about that. You're braver than most, or more foolish. I'm trying to understand the house's history. Anything you have on Harrison Whitlock, the construction, the family." Patricia set down her pen. "We have quite a bit, actually. The Whitlocks were prominent. Hard to avoid them in the archives. Give me a few minutes." She disappeared into the back rooms and returned with a cardboard box and several bound volumes of newspapers. "These are copies. Originals are too fragile. The box has what we've collected on the Whitlock family. The newspapers cover 1880 through 1930. You'll find plenty about Harrison in there." Sylvia spent the next 4 hours reading. The newspapers painted a picture of a man who'd arrived in Montana Territory in 1881 with modest capital and outsized ambition. Within 5 years, he owned 2 copper mines. Within 10, he'd expanded into timber and real estate. The papers called him a visionary, a captain of industry, a builder of the New West. But there were other stories too, buried in the back pages. A mine collapse in 1895 that killed 6 workers. Investigation inconclusive. A labor strike in 1903 broken by hired enforcers. 3 workers hospitalized. Accusations of bribery regarding railroad contracts. Charges dismissed. A string of mysterious disappearances among union organizers between 1910 and 1920. No arrests ever. Maid, she found her grandfather's name in a 1919 article about a mining accident investigation. James Dornan, mine foreman, testified that all safety procedures were followed. The article was brief, noting that the investigation concluded with no findings of negligence despite 3 deaths, $800 for silence. That's what the ledger had said. Sylvia sat back, feeling sick. Her grandfather had been paid to lie, to cover up safety violations that had killed men. She'd always thought of him as a quiet, decent man, the little she knew of him from her father's sparse stories. Now she had to reconcile that image with this ugly truth. She cross-referenced more names from the ledger with the newspapers. Judge Samuel Brennan, multiple mentions, always favorable coverage of his rulings. Sheriff Hiram Kemp, credited with maintaining order during labor disputes. Carl Voss, mine superintendent, praised for efficiency and productivity. A pattern emerged. The men Whitlock paid weren't just taking bribes. They were part of a system, a network of corruption that touched every level of valley life. Judges, lawmen, foremen, newspapermen, all of them working together to protect Whitlock's interests and silence anyone who threatened. Then the last newspaper article about Harrison himself was dated December 1923, Copper. King Vanish's foul play suspected. It reported that both Harrison and his son James had disappeared from the mansion sometime during the night of November 18. No signs of struggle, no ransom demands, no bodies ever found. The investigation went nowhere. Within a year, the story had faded from the papers. Sylvia copied relevant articles, made notes, and thanked Patricia as she prepared to leave. "Find what you needed?" Patricia asked. "More than I wanted to." Sylvia hesitated. "Did your family have connections to Whitlock?" Patricia's expression went carefully neutral. "My great-grandfather was Carl Voss. He ran Whitlock's largest mine." She paused. "We don't talk about him much in my family." There are stories, but well, the past is complicated. Yes, Sylvia agreed quietly. It is. Back at the mansion, armed with new knowledge, Sylvia began searching for the rooms marked on the surveyor's map. The north wing seemed the most promising place to start. She'd noticed the wall configuration didn't quite match the map's layout. In what should have been a servant's bedroom, she found a section of wall paneling that sounded hollow when tapped. The panels were tongue and groove, painted over so many times the seams were almost invisible. But when she looked closely, she could see where the paint had cracked along one vertical line. She used a pry bar to work the panel loose. Behind it, instead of wall studs, there was darkness, a doorway, sealed up, hidden behind false walls. But still there, Sylvia pulled away more panels, revealing a door frame. The door itself had been nailed shut and painted over, but it was substantial, heavy oak with iron hinges. She worked carefully, removing nails, prying away layers of paint and wood. It took 2 hours, but finally the door swung open. Stone steps descended into darkness. The air that emerged was cold and damp, carrying a smell of earth and something else, something old and unpleasant. She tested the first step. Solid. The second. The stairs were steep and narrow, carved into the foundation rock. She descended slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At the bottom, she found herself in a brick-walled room, maybe 12 feet square. The floor was packed earth. The ceiling was low enough that she could touch it. And mounted on the walls were iron rings, 4 of them at waist height, spaced evenly around the room. This was the cold room, and it hadn't been built for storage. Sylvia felt her stomach turn. The rings were for restraints, for holding people. The scratch marks on the brick walls confirmed it, desperate claw marks where fingers had scraped against the surface. And carved into the brick, barely visible, were initials and dates. TP 1922, RM 1921, JD 1922, JD, her grandfather's initials. The year before, Whitlock disappeared. Had her grandfather been held here? Or had he been complicit in holding others? She found the worker's badge, 247, in her pocket, and looked at it in the flashlight beam. Thomas Pritchard, perhaps. TP, someone who'd been brought to this room and never left. Sylvia sat on the bottom step, overwhelmed. This wasn't just historical corruption she'd uncovered. This was a torture chamber. A place where Whitlock had brought people who threatened him, who needed to be broken or silenced or eliminated. The mansion wasn't just built on suffering. It was designed for it. She stayed in the cold room for a long time, bearing witness to what had happened here. The scratches in the brick, the iron rings, the carved initials, they deserved to be seen, to be acknowledged. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were evidence of real people who'd suffered in this place. When she finally climbed back up the stairs, the afternoon had faded to evening. She sealed the doorway with a piece of plywood. She wasn't ready to close it permanently, but she couldn't leave it open either. That night, Vernon called to check on her. She told him about the surveyor's map and the hidden room, but not about her grandfather's initials in the brick. Some things she needed to process alone first. "You should be careful," Vernon said, his voice grave. "You're digging into things that people wanted buried. Still want buried, maybe. I know, do you? Because I'm starting to wonder if there's more to this than just old history." He was right, of course, but Sylvia had gone too far to turn back now. The mansion had pulled her in, and she had to see it through to whatever end awaited. The next morning, Sylvia returned to the Historical Society with the worker's badge. Patricia looked up as she entered, and something in Sylvia's expression made her set aside her work immediately. "What did you find?" Sylvia placed the badge on the desk. "Number 247. I think it belonged to someone who worked in Whitlock's mines. Someone who disappeared." Patricia pulled out a different ledger, employment records from the copper mining operations. Her finger traced down columns of names and numbers. "Here, Thomas Pritchard, badge 247, hired in 1919, last recorded shift March 1922. There's a notation, left employment without notice." "He didn't leave," Sylvia said quietly. "I found his initials carved in a brick wall in the mansion's basement. Along with the date, 1922, Patricia's face went pale. Show me what you found. Over the next hour, Sylvia described the cold room, the iron rings, the scratch marks and initials. Patricia listened without interrupting, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. Thomas Pritchard had a family, Patricia said finally. She pulled out a folder from the archives. Wife named Elizabeth, 3 children. When he disappeared, Elizabeth filed a missing person report. Look at this. She spread out photocopies of old police documents. The investigation into Pritchard's disappearance had lasted less than a week. Sheriff Hiram Kemp, whose name appeared in Whitlock's ledger, concluded that Pritchard had abandoned his family and left the area. The case was closed, but Elizabeth Pritchard had written letters to the sheriff, to the county attorney, to the newspaper. She insisted her husband wouldn't leave, that something terrible had happened. She mentioned that Thomas had been organizing workers, pushing for better safety conditions. The letters went unanswered. Eventually they stopped. What happened to the family? Sylvia asked. Elizabeth worked as a seamstress, barely kept the children fed. 2 of them died young, illness, malnutrition. The 3rd left the valley as soon as she was old enough. Patricia closed the folder. This wasn't just corruption, Sylvia. People died. Families were destroyed. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of history heavy between them. What are you going to do? Patricia asked. I don't know yet. But I can't just ignore this. Be careful who you talk to. The Whitlock name still carries weight around here. And some families, she stopped, choosing her words carefully. Some families have reasons to want this buried. That afternoon, Vernon arrived at the mansion with supplies, lumber, nails, roofing materials. He also brought news. Had an interesting visitor at the store this morning, he said as they unloaded his truck. Douglas Whitlock, Sylvia straightened. Who? Harrison's great-grandson. Lives over in Helena, runs some kind of investment company. He was asking about you, about the mansion sale. Vernon's expression was troubled. He seemed real interested in whether you'd found anything in the house. What did you tell him? That I didn't know anything. But he's not a man who takes no for an answer easily. Vernon set down a box of roofing nails. He asked if the house was still available for purchase. Said he'd been out of the country during the auction, missed his chance to bid. Wanted to know if you'd consider selling. For how much? He didn't name a figure. Just said he'd make it worth your while. They carried supplies into the house. Vernon noticed the plywood covering the sealed doorway in the north wing. That where you found the room. Yes? Mind if I look? Sylvia pulled away the plywood, and they descended together. Vernon stood in the cold room for a long time, studying the iron rings, the scratch marks, the carved initials. His face hardened. My grandfather's name was Hiram Kemp, he said finally. He was sheriff here for 28 years. When I was a boy, people spoke of him like he was a hero, kept the peace, maintained order. He touched one of the iron rings. My father never talked about him much. Now I think I know why. Vernon, he was part of this. Whatever happened in this room, he knew about it. Maybe he helped. Vernon's voice was rough. That's a hard thing to learn about your own blood. We can't choose what our ancestors did. Only what we do with what they left behind. Vernon nodded slowly. You're going to keep digging into this, aren't you? I have to. Then I'm with you. My grandfather's sins don't have to be my sins. Maybe it's time someone from the Kemp family did the right thing. That evening, a black SUV pulled up the drive. Sylvia watched from the window as a man climbed out, maybe 55, well-dressed in clothes that looked expensive and out of place in the mountain setting. He approached the front door with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. She opened the door before he could knock. Miss Dornan? His smile was professional, revealing nothing. Douglas Whitlock, I hope you don't mind the unannounced visit. What can I do for you, Mr. Whitlock? I wanted to congratulate you on your purchase. This house has been in my family for generations. I have to admit I'm a bit sentimental about it. He looked past her into the entry hall. I was wondering if you'd consider selling. I'd be willing to offer $50,000, significantly more than you paid. The house isn't for sale, I understand. You just acquired it. But the place needs extensive repairs. The costs could be considerable. His tone remained pleasant, but his eyes were assessing, calculating. My offer would give you a substantial profit with none of the headache. I appreciate the offer, but no. Something flickered in his expression, annoyance perhaps, or calculation. May I ask why you wanted this particular property? There are better houses in better condition available in the valley. It spoke to me. Interesting. He glanced around the porch at the peeling paint and sagging boards. The house has a complicated history. Not all of it pleasant. You might find it more trouble than it's worth. Is that a warning, Mr. Whitlock? Advice from someone familiar with the property's challenges. His smile never wavered. Old houses can be dangerous. Structural issues, electrical problems. Accidents happen, especially to people working alone. The threat was barely veiled. Sylvia met his gaze steadily. I'm careful. I hope so. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. In case you change your mind, the offer stands. She took the card but didn't look at it. I won't. After he left, Sylvia locked the door and leaned against it. Her hands were shaking, not from fear but from anger. Douglas Whitlock knew. Maybe not all the details, but he knew something was hidden in this house, something he didn't want found. Vernon had stayed out of sight during the visit. Now he emerged from the kitchen. That felt like a threat. It was. You need to think about security. Better locks at minimum. Maybe a phone line installed so you're not isolated up here. I will. But I'm not leaving and I'm not selling. That night, someone broke into the mansion. Sylvia woke to the sound of splintering wood downstairs. She grabbed the rifle her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12 and moved quietly to the top of the stairs. The front door stood open. Flashlight beams played across the entry hall. 2 figures, maybe 3, moving through the rooms systematically. She chambered around. The sound echoed in the stairwell, sharp and unmistakable. The movement below stopped. I'm armed, Sylvia called down. And I've already called the sheriff. A lie, but she didn't have a phone line yet. Leave now. For a moment, nothing. Then rapid footsteps, the front door banging, the sound of an engine starting. By the time she reached the first floor, they were gone. She checked the house methodically. They'd forced the kitchen door. She'd need a new lock. The kitchen vault stood open, its hidden panel obvious now. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers pulled out, cabinets opened. They'd been looking for something specific. The ledger, probably. But she'd hidden it 2 days ago, tucked inside a hollowed-out book in the library. A precaution that now seemed prescient. Some documents were missing. She couldn't tell which ones. But the stack of papers from the vault was noticeably thinner. They'd taken what they could find and run when confronted. Sylvia spent the rest of the night awake, rifle across her lap, anger burning cold and steady. Someone, almost certainly connected to Douglas Whitlock, had violated her home, tried to steal evidence, tried to erase history, but the ledger was safe. And now she had another reason to keep digging. By dawn, she'd made copies of the most important ledger pages. She drove to town and left them with Patricia at the Historical Society, along with instructions to make them public if anything happened to her. Vernon helped her install new locks, motion sensor lights, and a security bar for the front door. They also set up a battery-powered radio so she could call for help if needed. You've made enemies, Vernon said as they worked. Powerful ones. Good. That means I'm doing something right. She meant it. The break-in had only strengthened her resolve. This house held secrets that someone desperately wanted to keep buried, which meant those secrets were worth uncovering, worth protecting, worth sharing with the world. Thomas Pritchard and the others who'd suffered here deserved justice, even if it came a century late. And Sylvia was going to make sure they got it, the sealed doorway in the master. Bedroom revealed itself on a Tuesday morning. Sylvia had been measuring for new window frames when she noticed the room's dimensions didn't match the surveyor's map. The east wall should have been 3 feet farther out. She tapped along the paneling until she found the hollow section. This time, she knew what to look for. The hidden door was more carefully concealed than the others, the seams expertly fitted, the paint matched perfectly. It took her an hour to locate the release mechanism, a small brass lever disguised as a decorative rosette. The panel swung open to reveal a walk-in closet, maybe 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Unlike the rest of the house, this space was pristine. No dust, no decay, as if it had been sealed away from time itself. Women's clothing hung on a rod, dresses from the 1890s, carefully preserved, still vibrant with color. A small shelf held children's toys, a wooden train, a tin soldier, a rag doll with button eyes. And on the wall, in an ornate silver frame, hung a daguerreotype photograph, a family portrait. The man in the center was unmistakably Harrison Whitlock, the same cold eyes from the group photograph, but here softened by the woman beside him and the small boy at their feet. The woman was beautiful, with dark hair and a gentle expression. The boy, maybe 5 years old, smiled at the camera. Sylvia lifted the frame carefully and found an inscription on the back. "To my beloved Anne and our son James, may they forgive me. H.W. 1893. She carried the photograph to the window, studying it in better light. This was the human side of Harrison Whitlock, a man who loved his wife and child, who sought their forgiveness even as he committed terrible acts. In a hatbox on the shelf, she found a diary bound in faded blue leather. The entries were written in careful feminine script, dated from 1888 to 1894, Anne Kershaw Whitlock's diary. Sylvia sat on the dusty floor and began to read. The early entries were hopeful, describing Anne's marriage to Harrison, her excitement about building a life in Montana, her joy at James's birth. But as the years progressed, the tone darkened. "Harrison grows more distant each day," Anne wrote in 1891. "The business consumes him. He speaks of nothing but expansion, profits, crushing his competitors. When I ask about the workers' complaints, he dismisses them with such coldness that I hardly recognize the man I married." A later entry: "I heard terrible rumors today. They say Harrison's men beat a union organizer, left him for dead on the road outside town. When I confronted Harrison, he would not meet my eyes. He said only that business required hard decisions that I couldn't possibly understand. But I do understand. I understand that my husband has become someone I fear. The final entries were the most disturbing. I've decided to take James and leave. I cannot raise my son in this house built on such suffering. Harrison has threatened me. He says I'll take nothing, that he'll make sure James never sees me again if I try. I'm afraid, truly afraid, but I cannot stay. God forgive me, I cannot stay." The diary ended abruptly in April 1894. According to the historical records, Anne had died that May, supposedly from complications of childbirth, though she hadn't been pregnant. Sylvia closed the diary, feeling the weight of Anne's trapped desperation. A woman who tried to escape but never got the chance. Another victim of Harrison Whitlock's empire. She spent the rest of the day researching Anne's death. The newspaper obituary was brief, respectful, revealing nothing. But Patricia, when Sylvia showed her the diary, provided additional context. "There were rumors," Patricia said quietly. "My grandmother mentioned them once. And Whitlock didn't die in childbirth. She fell down the main staircase, broke her neck. But there was talk that it wasn't an accident. Harrison killed her. No one could prove anything. The sheriff, Hiram Kemp, investigated and ruled it accidental. But people wondered. Anne had been seen with bruises before. And Harrison had everything to lose if she left and took James. Another name for the ledger of suffering. Another life, destroyed by Harrison's need for control. That afternoon, Patricia called with new information. She'd found a sealed court document from 1924, archived in the county records building. A civil case brought by families of missing minors against the Whitlock estate after Harrison's disappearance. The families had demanded answers, compensation, justice. They'd presented evidence of safety violations, suspicious disappearances, intimidation. The case had looked promising until the judge dismissed it on technical grounds. The judge's name was Samuel Brennan, one of the names in Harrison's ledger. "The fix was in from the start," Patricia said. "Even after Harrison was gone, his money protected his legacy. The families got nothing." Sylvia's anger grew cold and focused. Every new discovery revealed another layer of corruption, another injustice that had never been addressed. The next complication arrived in the form of a county building inspector. His name was Morton Briggs, and he arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and an officious manner. He claimed to have received concerns about the mansion's structural integrity and needed to conduct a full inspection. Sylvia let him in, watching as he moved through the house with obvious purpose. He documented every crack, every water stain, every loose board. His findings grew more dramatic as the inspection continued. "Significant structural deficiencies," he announced, writing furiously. "Compromised foundation in multiple areas. Electrical system completely inadequate and dangerous. Plumbing violations throughout. This property is not habitable. I'm aware it needs work. That's why I'm renovating. You can't live here during renovations. Too dangerous." He tore off a form and handed it to her. "You have 30 days to vacate. After that, the county may need to condemn the property. Under what authority?" County Building Code, Section 42, subsection C. Structures deemed unsafe for occupancy. He gave her a thin smile. "I'm sure you'll find the relevant statutes on file at the county office." After he left, Sylvia called Vernon. He arrived within the hour, bringing Sam Torres with him, a retired contractor who'd built half the houses in the valley. Sam was 62, stocky and grey-haired, with the kind of competence that came from 50 years of working with his hands. He walked through the house slowly, examining everything Briggs had documented. "He's exaggerating," Sam said finally. "Yes, there are issues. The roof needs work, some windows need replacing, and the electrical should be updated. But condemn it? That's excessive. This house has good bones. I can have it up to code in 90 days. Will you help me?" Sam looked at Vernon, then back at Sylvia. "I heard about Douglas Whitlock's visit. I know what you're dealing with here. And I've got no love for the Whitlock family. My uncle died in one of their mines back in '08. If you're willing to fight them, I'm willing to help." They spent the rest of the day planning the renovation. Sam had connections, plumbers, electricians, roofers who'd work for fair wages. Vernon offered to handle the lumber and supplies at cost. Together, they could have the mansion not just habitable, but genuinely restored within 3 months. But they'd need help with one more thing. The safe in Harrison's hidden office, the one Sylvia had discovered behind a false wall in the dining room. Vernon knew someone who could help. Gene Kovach, a retired locksmith who'd opened every safe in the county at one time or another. He was 70 years old, discreet, and according to Vernon, wouldn't ask questions he didn't need answers to. Gene arrived the next day in a truck older than Sylvia. He was lean and weathered, with steady hands and sharp eyes that assessed the safe with professional interest. 1920s Mosler, he said, running his fingers over the dial. Good quality. Someone wanted whatever's in here to stay secure. It took him 3 hours, working with patience and occasional muttered commentary. But finally the tumblers aligned and the safe door swung open. Inside were more ledgers, 3 of them, more detailed than the first. Legal documents, deeds, contracts, and sealed letters tied with ribbon, addressed to various people. Sylvia reached for one addressed, simply, "To whoever finds this." The letter was written in Harrison Whitlock's distinctive handwriting, dated November 15, 1923, 3 days before he disappeared. She held it carefully, aware that this document might answer questions that had haunted the valley for a century. Vernon, Sam, and Jean watched silently as she broke the wax seal. The letter was 5 pages long, written in clear, desperate prose. Harrison's confession. Everything he'd done, everyone he'd paid, every crime he'd committed or ordered. The murders, the bribes, the violence. Names were listed, amounts documented, locations specified. But it was more than a confession. It was an explanation. "I write this," Harrison began, "knowing that I am a doomed man, that my partners will not let me live to betray them. After Anne's death, which I did not cause, but failed to prevent, I could no longer bear the weight of what I had become. I attempted to reform, to make amends, but the machine I helped build was too powerful to stop. When I informed my partners that I intended to turn evidence over to federal authorities, they made their intentions clear. I'm watched constantly. My son James is threatened. If I act, he dies. If I remain silent, I am complicit in continued suffering. He detailed his partners, Judge Samuel Brennan, Sheriff Hiram Kemp, Mine Superintendent Carl Voss, the three men who'd helped him build and maintain his corrupt empire. They'd discovered his plan to confess and had given him an ultimatum: destroy the evidence or watch his son die. I cannot destroy what I have documented, Harrison wrote. These ledgers represent the only justice the victims might ever receive. So I have hidden them, created insurance, and written this confession. If you are reading this, it means I am dead, likely buried on this property with James beside me. Find us, give us proper burial, and let the truth be known. The letter ended with specific instructions. My body and my son's will be found where the mountain meets the foundation, beneath the stone angel in the eastern cemetery. The evidence you need is in this safe and in the hidden office above. Use it. And what I could not. Sylvia set the letter down with shaking hands. Vernon's face had gone pale, his grandfather named as one of the murderers. Jean and Sam sat in stunned silence. He knew they'd kill him, Patricia said. She'd arrived while Jean worked on the safe. He chose documentation over survival. Maybe that was his redemption, or maybe it was just guilt, Vernon said bitterly. Guilt that came too late to matter, but it did matter, Sylvia thought. It mattered to the families who'd never known what happened to their loved ones. It mattered to the historical record. It mattered to justice, however delayed. We need to excavate, she said. Find the bodies. Confirm everything Harrison claimed. That's evidence of murder, Sam pointed out. We should involve the police, the sheriff's office. Vernon shook his head. You saw how quickly that building inspector showed up. Douglas Whitlock has connections. We need to verify everything first, then go to the state police or the FBI. They agreed to excavate the next morning. But that evening, Douglas appeared again, this time with two men who looked like security contractors. He didn't bother with pleasantries. You need to leave. Miss Dornan, you're in over your head. Is that a threat? It's a statement of fact. You're playing with things you don't understand. My family built this valley. We own it. You're nothing but a temporary inconvenience. Sylvia held her ground, though her heart hammered. I know what your great-grandfather did. I know about the murders, the bribes, the people who disappeared. And I'm going to make sure everyone else knows too. Douglas's expression went cold. You think anyone will care about ancient history? My family's attorneys will bury you in lawsuits. We'll tie this property up in court for decades. And accidents happen, Ms. Dornan, especially to people working alone in dangerous, isolated properties. After they left, Vernon insisted on staying the night. Sam and Jean agreed to return at dawn with excavation equipment. Sylvia sat up late, reading through the rest of the documents from the safe. Harrison's confession was just the beginning. The ledgers documented a century of corruption, extending far beyond Harrison's death. Someone had continued keeping records, entries dated into the 1940s, then the 1950s, finally ending in 1955, the year the mansion was abandoned. The corruption hadn't died with Harrison. It had simply evolved, continued, found new forms. And Douglas Whitlock was protecting not just his great-grandfather's reputation, but an active criminal enterprise that still existed. This was bigger than she'd imagined, and far more dangerous. Dawn came cold and grey. Sylvia, Vernon, Sam, Jean, and Patricia gathered at the eastern edge of the property where the old cemetery sat behind a rusted iron fence. The cemetery was small, maybe a dozen graves, most unmarked or with stones so weathered the names had worn away. But in the center stood a marble angel, arms outstretched, face turned skyward. It was the only monument still intact, still recognizable, where the mountain meets the foundation, beneath the stone angel. Sylvia quoted from Harrison's letter. Sam had brought shovels and a small excavator he'd borrowed from a friend. They marked out an area 3 feet from the angel's base and began to dig. The soil came up easily at first, loamy earth mixed with pine needles and decayed leaves. Then at about 3 feet down, Sam's shovel hit something solid. Wood, rotted but still recognizable as planks. They cleared away the soil carefully, revealing the outline of a coffin. The wood had mostly disintegrated, but the shape was unmistakable. Inside, wrapped in the remnants of fabric, were bones, human remains. A complete skeleton, laid out as if for burial. Scraps of clothing still clung to the bones, the remains of a suit from the 1920s, and in the skull, clearly visible, was a bullet hole. Harrison Whitlock, Vernon said quietly, but there was more. Beside the first body, wrapped in canvas that had fared better than the wooden coffin, was a second, smaller skeleton. Younger, perhaps late teens or early 20s, James, Harrison's son. Patricia made a small sound, something between grief and anger. Gene removed his cap. Sam set down his shovel and stepped back. For several minutes they stood in silence, looking down at the two bodies that had lain hidden for nearly a century. Father and son, murdered together, buried in secret. Sylvia photographed everything carefully, the location, the remains, the bullet hole, the remnants of clothing. Evidence that would prove Harrison's confession was true. Then she noticed something in the smaller skeleton's hand. Something metallic, clutched in the bones of the fingers. She knelt and carefully extracted it. An iron key. Unusual design, octagonal shaft, elaborate teeth. It had been important enough for James to hold on to even in death. Or perhaps it had been placed there deliberately. What does it open? Patricia asked. I don't know yet, but we'll find out. They covered the remains carefully, marking the location. Tomorrow, they'd contact the state police, but for now they needed to understand the full scope of what they were dealing with. Back at the mansion, they cleaned the key and examined it closely. Gene recognized the craftsmanship immediately, custom-made. High-security lock, probably for something important. The kind of key you don't make copies of. He turned it over in his weathered hands. Whatever this opens, someone went to a lot of trouble to protect it. Sylvia thought about the mansion's architecture, the hidden rooms, the surveyor's map. There was still one area they hadn't fully explored, the attic. The map showed a finished space up there, but she'd only glanced into it through the access panel. The attic entrance was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a narrow hallway. The door had a modern deadbolt, added sometime in the last few decades, but below it was an antique keyhole that matched the key's design. Sam forced the deadbolt with a pry bar. Then Sylvia inserted James's key. It turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting a century for this moment. The door opened onto a narrow staircase, surprisingly well preserved. They climbed single file, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The attic had been converted into a full office, not a storage space, but a working room. Filing cabinets lined the walls. A desk sat beneath a dormer window. Photographs covered one wall like a gallery of the damned. This had been Harrison's true sanctum, his secret archive. They spread out, opening cabinets, examining files. What they found was staggering. Harrison hadn't just documented his own crimes. He'd documented decades of regional corruption. Railroad bribes in the 1890s, timber fraud in the 1900s, political conspiracies in the 1910s, names of senators, governors, judges, businessmen, some of the most prominent families in Montana history. But the most disturbing discovery was a ledger marked The Trust. Patricia opened it carefully. The entries began in 1895, a formal organization of the most powerful men in the region. Harrison Whitlock, Samuel Brennan, Hiram Kemp, Carl Voss, and 6 others. They called themselves the Trust, and their purpose was clear: to control mining, timber, and transportation across 4 states through coordinated corruption. They set prices, eliminated competition, bought politician, and silenced opposition. They maintained detailed records of every transaction, every bribed official, every eliminated obstacle, and the ledger didn't end in 1923. The handwriting changed after Harrison's death, but the entries continued. Through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, new names appeared, sons and grandsons of the original members, carrying on the family business. The last entry was dated March 1955. Assets transferred to Whitlock Holdings, LLC. Vernon found the incorporation documents in another filing cabinet. Whitlock Holdings, established in 1955, with Douglas Whitlock's grandfather as the founding member. They just kept going, Sam said, his voice hollow. They killed Harrison to protect themselves, took over his operation, and ran it for another 30 years before finally shutting down this house. Did they shut down? Patricia held up a folder she'd found. Look at this. Whitlock Holdings still exists. Current CEO, Douglas Whitlock. Current board members. She read the names, and Sylvia recognized several from around the valley. Business owners, local politicians, even the current sheriff. The trust never ended, Sylvia said. It just went legitimate, or at least more carefully hidden. Jean had been examining another section of files. These are modern. Look, financial statements from 2020, 2022, investment portfolios, shell companies, offshore accounts. He spread them across the desk. This isn't just historical. These are active financial crimes. The implications settled over them slowly. They weren't just uncovering a historical conspiracy. They were uncovering an ongoing criminal enterprise that had operated for over a century, evolving with the times, but never truly changing. And Douglas Whitlock wasn't just protecting his great-grandfather's reputation. He was protecting an active operation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. We need federal authorities, Vernon said. State police at minimum, probably FBI. This is beyond anything local law can handle. We need proof they can't dismiss or destroy, Patricia added. Photographs of everything, copies stored in multiple locations. They spent the rest of the day documenting the attic's contents. Sylvia photographed every page of the trust ledger, every financial document, every piece of evidence. Patricia made detailed notes. Sam and Jean carefully catalogued the filing cabinet's contents. As evening approached, Patricia made a call to a contact she had, someone who'd worked in the U.S. Attorney's office in Helena. She explained the situation carefully, without revealing everything, and got a name: Special Agent Rachel Cordova. FBI White-Collar Crime Division. She's the one we need, Patricia said after hanging up. But we have to be careful. If Douglas has connections in local law enforcement, he might have them in state agencies too. That night, they gathered in the mansion's dining room, exhausted but determined. The evidence was undeniable. Harrison's confession, the bodies, the trust ledgers, the modern financial crimes. It was all there, carefully documented, waiting for justice. But Sylvia's phone rang before they could finalize their plan. Douglas Whitlock's voice was cold, controlled. I know what you found in the attic. I know you have documents that belong to my family. This is your final warning. Walk away now, take a generous settlement, and forget everything. Or face consequences you can't imagine. How did you think you're the only one who can hire people to watch? I've known every move you've made since you bought this cursed house. His voice dropped lower. You have until midnight tomorrow. After that, I can't guarantee your safety. Any of you, the line went dead. Vernon stood immediately. He's bluffing. He has to be. Maybe, Sam said. But we should take precautions. Get the evidence somewhere safe. Make sure we're not alone. They worked quickly, making additional copies of the most critical documents. Patricia would take one set to a secure location. Jean would take another. Sam would keep a third. And Sylvia would upload everything to a cloud storage account, accessible only with a password she'd share with all of them. By midnight, the evidence was distributed and secured. They'd done everything they could to protect it. But as her allies left and Sylvia was alone again in the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a point of no return. Douglas wasn't making empty threats. The trust had killed before. Harrison, James, Thomas Pritchard, and probably dozens of others over the decades. They'd killed to protect their empire. They'd kill again. Sylvia checked the locks, loaded her father's rifle, and settled in to wait for dawn. Tomorrow they'd contact the FBI. Tomorrow they'd turn over everything they'd found. Tomorrow justice might finally begin. But first, she had to survive the night. Outside, the mountain wind whistled through the pines. And somewhere in the darkness, she knew, Douglas Whitlock's people were watching, waiting, deciding how far they were willing to go to protect secrets that had lasted a century. Sylvia didn't sleep. She spent the night in the attic office, surrounded by the evidence of a century's worth of crimes, cataloguing every detail she might have missed. As dawn broke through the dormer window, her phone rang. Patricia's voice was urgent. "I reached Agent Cordova. She wants to meet this morning. State Police Barracks in Ravalli County, 2 hours from here. She's driving up from Helena. I'll be there. Sylvia, be careful on the drive. Watch for anyone following you." Vernon arrived 20 minutes later to escort her. They took his truck, leaving Sylvia's at the mansion as a decoy. The drive was tense, both of them checking mirrors constantly, but they saw no signs of pursuit. The State Police Barracks was a low, functional building surrounded by patrol cars. Inside, a receptionist led them to a conference room where a woman in her late 40s waited. Professional in a dark suit, with intelligent eyes that assessed them immediately, Special Agent Rachel Cordova. "FBI." She shook their hands. "Patricia Voss sent me preliminary information, but I need to hear everything directly from you." For the next 2 hours, Sylvia laid out the complete story. The auction, the hidden vault, the ledgers, the cold room, the bodies, the attic archive. She showed Cordova photographs of everything. The evidence was overwhelming. Cordova listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression growing more serious as the narrative unfolded. When Sylvia finished, the agent sat back. "This is substantial. If even half of what you're showing me holds up, we're looking at historical corruption on a massive scale and potentially active financial crimes." She tapped the photographs of the modern documents. "These financial statements, if authentic, indicate ongoing fraud, money laundering, possibly racketeering." "It's all authentic," Sylvia said. "Harrison Whitlock documented everything, and someone kept documenting after his death. The problem," Cordova said carefully, "is jurisdiction and time. The historical crimes are beyond the statute of limitations. We can't prosecute anyone for murders committed in 1923, but the financial crimes, those are current, actionable. What about the bodies? We'll coordinate with state police to excavate properly, conduct forensic analysis, confirm identification. That's important for historical record and for the families. But criminally," she spread her hands, "everyone responsible is long dead." Vernon leaned forward. "What about Douglas Whitlock?" "He's threatened us. He broke into the mansion, tried to steal evidence." "Did you report the break-in?" "No, the local sheriff. We have reason to believe he's compromised." Cordova nodded slowly. "That complicates things. But it also gives us an opportunity. If Douglas Whitlock is actively trying to suppress evidence, obstruct investigation, that's a current crime." She reviewed her notes. "Here's what we need. The physical ledgers from the attic. We'll need to verify authenticity, establish chain of custody. Can you retrieve them?" "The mansion is being watched," Sylvia said. "Douglas knows we found the attic. He knows what's there. Then we need to move quickly." Cordova made a call, spoke quietly into her phone, then turned back to them. "I can have a team ready by dawn tomorrow. State police will execute a warrant to secure the premises and recover evidence." But she looked at Sylvia directly. "We need someone who knows exactly where everything is hidden. Someone who can guide the team through the mansion's layout. I'll do it. It could be dangerous. If Douglas realizes what's happening, if he has people watching the property." "I'll do it," Sylvia repeated. Cordova studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. 5 a.m. tomorrow. We'll have a full team, FBI, state police. You'll be protected throughout." She paused. "Until then, I strongly recommend you stay somewhere secure. Not the mansion, not your homes. Somewhere Douglas can't easily find you." Vernon suggested his nephew's hunting cabin, 40 miles north in the Sapphire Mountains. No one would think to look there. Sam, Jean, and Patricia agreed to meet them there. They gathered at the cabin that evening, 5 people who'd become unlikely allies in pursuit of truth. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a wood stove and enough provisions to last several days. Over dinner, they talked about what tomorrow might bring. Sam worried about violence. Jean wondered if the FBI could really protect them. Patricia worried about what exposing the trust would do to the valley. So many prominent families implicated, businesses that might collapse, reputations destroyed. Some reputations deserve destroying, Vernon said quietly. My grandfather's included. He was a murderer. He helped kill Harrison and James, helped bury their bodies. That's not a legacy worth protecting. What about the innocent descendants? Patricia asked. People who had nothing to do with their ancestors' crimes? The truth is the truth, Sylvia said. We can't protect people from their family history, but we can make sure the victims are finally acknowledged. Thomas Pritchard's family deserves to know what happened to him. Anne Whitlock deserves to have her real story told. All of them do. The conversation stretched into the night. They talked about justice and responsibility, about the weight of history and the courage needed to confront it. By the time they went to sleep, Sylvia felt the bond between them. 5 people from different generations and backgrounds, united by a commitment to do what was right despite the cost. But at 3 a.m., Sylvia's phone rang. An unknown number, she answered. Douglas Whitlock's voice was different now, not controlled, but desperate, angry. You stupid woman. You've ruined everything. Do you understand what you've done? My family built this valley. We employed thousands, created wealth, made this place what it is. And you're going to destroy it all for what? Some ancient grievances? For the truth. The truth? He laughed bitterly. The truth is that power requires hard decisions. My great-grandfather understood that. He built an empire because he was willing to do what others wouldn't. Yes, there were costs. But the benefits were built on murder. Everyone's dead. The victims, the perpetrators, all of them are bones in the ground. What difference does it make now? It makes a difference to their families, to history, to justice. There was a long silence. When Douglas spoke again, his voice was cold. You're making a terrible mistake. My family doesn't lose, Miss Dornan. We have resources you can't imagine. We'll fight this for decades. We'll destroy you, your friends, anyone who helps you. The FBI might think they have a case, but they don't know who they're dealing with. Maybe it's time you learned what happens when people stand up to you. She hung up. Vernon was awake, listening. He's scared. That makes him more dangerous, I know, but we're committed now. We see this through. The next morning, they drove to the mansion in convoy, Cordova's FBI unit, 3 state police vehicles, Vernon's truck carrying Sylvia and her allies. The sun was just breaking over the mountains as they pulled up the drive. The mansion stood silent in the early light. No sign of Douglas or his people. Cordova's team moved quickly, securing the perimeter, establishing positions. Sylvia led them inside, up to the 3rd floor, to the attic entrance. The door stood open. Someone had been here since they'd left. The modern deadbolt was broken, hanging loose. They climbed to the attic office. Everything was in disarray. Filing cabinets had been forced open, papers scattered. Someone had tried to remove evidence, to destroy what they could, but they'd missed things. Hidden in the rafters, Sylvia found another metal box she'd noticed but hadn't opened. Inside was a final surprise, a notarized affidavit. Dated November 14th, 1923, bearing Harrison Whitlock's signature and a federal clerk's seal. It was a legal document, intended for federal prosecutors, formally testifying to everything Harrison had documented. He'd actually filed it with a federal clerk in Helena, but it had been suppressed, buried, never investigated. But it still existed, and it was legally admissible evidence. This changes everything, Cordova said, reading it carefully. This isn't just documentation, it's sworn testimony. Combined with the physical evidence, the ledgers, the bodies, we have a prosecutable case for ongoing conspiracy. The FBI team spent 6 hours cataloging and removing evidence. The trust ledgers, the financial documents, the incorporation papers for Whitlock Holdings, all of it loaded into evidence boxes. Photographed, documented with meticulous care. By noon, Douglas arrived with 2 lawyers and his private security. He tried to enter the mansion but was stopped by state police. This is an active federal investigation, Cordova informed him. You're not permitted on the premises. This is my family's property. This is Ms. Dornan's property, legally purchased. And it's now a crime scene related to multiple ongoing investigations. Cordova held up a folder. Douglas Whitlock, you're being detained for questioning regarding obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud." His face went pale. "You can't, I haven't. You broke into this property. You destroyed federal evidence. You threatened witnesses." Cordova nodded to the state police officers. "You have the right to remain silent." As they led him away, his lawyers protesting loudly, Sylvia felt something release in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly, not even relief. Just the simple sense that justice, however delayed, was finally moving forward. The investigation would take months, maybe years. The legal battles would be complex, expensive, brutal. But the truth was out now. The evidence was secured. The victims would be acknowledged, and the mansion, the house she'd bought for $1, had finally given up its darkest secrets. Vernon stood beside her on the porch as the FBI vehicles prepared to leave. "Your father would be proud," he said. Quietly, Sylvia touched the compass in her pocket, feeling its familiar weight. "I hope so. What will you do now?" "With the house?" She looked up at the mansion's weathered facade, thinking about everything it represented. The suffering it had witnessed, the secrets it had held, the justice it had finally enabled. "I'm going to restore it," she said. "And I'm going to make sure people know what happened here. All of it, the victims, the corruption, the century of silence. This house is going to tell the truth," Vernon smiled. "Then you'll need help. And I know just the people." 2 weeks after Douglas's arrest, Sylvia sat in Agent Cordova's temporary office in Missoula, reviewing the progress of the investigation. "The preliminary hearings begin next month," Cordova explained, spreading documents across the desk. "We've indicted Douglas Whitlock and 6 associates on conspiracy, financial fraud, money laundering, and obstruction charges. The evidence is solid. The trust ledgers, the modern financial documents, Harrison's affidavit. Defense attorneys are already talking about plea deals. What about the local officials? The sheriff? Sheriff Brennan has accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. He's cooperating fully, names, dates, operations. It's opening up connections we didn't even know existed." Cordova leaned back in her chair. "This case is bigger than anyone anticipated. The trust's influence spread across 4 states, multiple industries. We're looking at dozens of potential prosecutions. The media attention had been intense. National news had picked up the story. Century-old criminal empire exposed by mountain woman. Reporters had descended on the valley, interviewing anyone with a connection to the case. Sylvia had done one carefully selected interview with a respected journalist, focusing on the victims rather than sensationalism. Public reaction was divided. Some people saw Sylvia as a hero who'd brought truth to light. Others, particularly those connected to trust, families, viewed her as a troublemaker who destroyed the valley's economy and reputation for no good reason. Several trust-connected businesses had already closed or declared bankruptcy. Others were under investigation. The economic impact was real, painful, unavoidable, but there was another side to the story. Families who'd spent generations wondering what happened to missing relatives finally had answers. The Pritchard descendants, Thomas's great-granddaughter, was still alive, living in Oregon, had flown in to thank Sylvia personally. The families were coming forward with their own stories, their own losses, finally validated after decades of silence. Vernon and Patricia had both faced difficult reckonings with their family histories. Vernon had written a public letter, acknowledging his grandfather's role in Harrison's murder and pledging restitution to victims' families. Patricia had done the same regarding her great-grandfather. Their courage had inspired. Others, several descendants of trust members, had made similar acknowledgments and commitments to make amends. Sam and Jean had become Sylvia's core team for the mansion restoration. Sam brought in skilled workers, carpenters, electricians, plumbers who needed work and were willing to be part of something meaningful. Jean helped secure materials at cost, calling in favors from suppliers across the region. The mansion was transforming. The cold room had been preserved exactly as found, but cleaned and documented. A memorial wall was being constructed, listing the names of known victims. Thomas Pritchard's badge would be displayed there, along with photographs and brief biographies. Anne Whitlock's closet had been carefully preserved. Her diary would be displayed with appropriate historical context, showing that even those who benefited from corruption could recognize its wrongness and try to escape. The attic office was being converted into an archive and research center. The trust ledgers and documents, copies, while originals remained FBI evidence, would be available for historians, researchers, students. The full truth, accessible to anyone who wanted to understand, but the transformation wasn't happening without resistance. Sylvia received threatening letters, anonymous, vicious, promising violence if she didn't stop destroying good people's names. Her truck had been vandalized twice. Someone had spray-painted "liar" across the mansion's front door. Vernon insisted on better security. They installed cameras, motion sensors, and a direct line to state police. Sam's nephew, a former Marine, stayed at the mansion most nights as security. Sylvia had also gotten a protective order against several individuals who'd made specific threats. The legal costs were mounting. Restoring the mansion wasn't cheap, and several trust-connected families had filed nuisance lawsuits trying to tie up the property in court. Sylvia had sold most of the gold coins to fund legal defense and renovation, keeping just enough to establish an endowment for the future memorial center. She'd also received an unexpected offer. A historical preservation foundation wanted to help, offering both funding and expertise. They saw the mansion as a unique opportunity, a site where difficult history could be confronted honestly, where education could emerge from tragedy. Patricia was working with the foundation to develop educational programs. School groups would be able to visit, learning not just about the crimes, but about systems of corruption, how power operates, why truth matters, even when it's painful. The excavation of Harrison and James's remains had been completed professionally. Forensic analysis confirmed their identities. The bullet in Harrison's skull matched a weapon registered to Sheriff Hiram Kemp in 1923. The evidence supported everything Harrison's confession had claimed. The bodies had been moved to a proper morgue while their final disposition was decided. Some Whitlock descendants wanted them buried in the family plot in the Valley Cemetery. Others wanted nothing to do with them. Eventually, a compromise was reached. They would be buried in the mansion's cemetery, beneath the stone angel, with honest markers that acknowledge both their humanity and their crimes. Harrison Whitlock, 1851-1923, copper baron, murderer, father, may truth be his legacy. James Whitlock, 1889-1923, son innocent, lost to his father's sins. The memorial service was scheduled for the following week. Victims' families had been invited. Some trust descendants would attend as well, to acknowledge the past and commit to a different future. But 3 days before the service, Douglas made bail. His lawyers had argued successfully that he wasn't a flight risk, that house arrest with monitoring was sufficient. The judge agreed, setting bail at $2 million. Douglas's business associates posted it within hours. Cordova called Sylvia immediately. "He's out. Restricted to his residence in Helena, ankle monitor, no contact with witnesses. But you should be extra careful. His legal team is aggressive, and he's made it clear he blames you for everything." That night, Sylvia couldn't sleep. She walked through the mansion in darkness, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a lonely woman in a mountain cabin, directionless, surviving, but not really living. Now she was at the center of a case that would reshape the valley's understanding of its own history. She thought about her father, his compass, his simple wisdom about following true north, even when the path was hard. She'd followed that compass here, to this house, to this purpose. And she wouldn't turn back now, no matter how difficult the journey became. Vernon found her in the library at 2 a.m., sitting in darkness. "Couldn't sleep either," he said, settling into a chair. "Been thinking about my grandfather. Hiram Kemp, Sheriff Kemp, everyone respected him. I respected him, or at least the memory of him. And all the while, he was a murderer. You're not responsible for what he did." No, but I'm responsible for what I do with what I know. That's why I'm glad we're doing this. The memorial, the education center. It won't undo the past, but maybe it prevents future wrongs. He paused. You ever regret buying this house? Sylvia considered the question. The threats, the danger, the crushing weight of responsibility, all of it was real. But so was the purpose, the meaning, the sense that her life finally mattered in ways that extended beyond her own survival. No, she said, I don't regret it. This house needed someone who'd listened to what it was trying to say. Maybe that's why the auction went the way it did. Maybe that's why I'm here. You believe in fate? I believe in showing up. I believe in doing the work that's in front of you, even when it's hard. The rest, she shrugged. The rest is just life. The next morning, Patricia arrived with news. Several journalists wanted to cover the memorial service. A documentary filmmaker was interested in creating a comprehensive history of the trust and its exposure. A university press wanted to publish a book about the case. Everyone wants a piece of this story, Patricia said. We need to control the narrative, make sure it stays focused on truth and victims rather than sensationalism. They spent the day preparing for the service, making final decisions about the memorial wall, reviewing the educational materials. Sam's team was finishing the last repairs, new roof, restored windows, electrical system up to code. The mansion was genuinely safe now, genuinely habitable. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Sylvia stood on the front porch with Jean. He was holding James's pocket watch. He'd cleaned and repaired it, got it working again. The ticking was steady, reliable, marking time that had seemed frozen for so long. Funny thing about time, Jean said. It keeps moving whether we pay attention or not. But sometimes you have to stop and acknowledge what was lost before you can move forward. That's what the memorial is for. That's what you're for, Jean corrected gently. You stopped. You paid attention. You refused to let the past stay buried. He handed her the watch. James would want you to have this. You gave him justice. That's worth more than gold. Sylvia held the watch carefully, feeling its weight, its steady rhythm. Tomorrow would bring the memorial service. Next week, the preliminary hearings would begin. The months ahead would be filled with testimony, trials, difficult truths aired in public forums. But tonight, standing on the porch of the mansion she'd bought for $1, Sylvia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the peace of easy comfort, but the peace of knowing you're doing what you're meant to do. The peace of following your compass true, even through difficult terrain. The mansion had been waiting for someone brave enough to hear its story. And she'd been waiting for a purpose worth fighting for. They'd found each other at exactly the right moment. Inside, Vernon was making coffee. Sam was reviewing security measures for tomorrow's service. Patricia was finalizing the guest list. Her allies, her chosen family, all working together toward justice. The mountain wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of coming autumn. Change was in the air, in the valley, in the mansion, in Sylvia's own life. She touched her father's compass in her pocket, James's watch in her hand. 2 timepieces, 2 legacies, one of integrity, one of innocence lost. Both pointing her toward the same destination. Tomorrow they would honor the dead. They would acknowledge the suffering. They would commit to remembering, and then the real work would begin, turning this mansion of secrets into a beacon of truth. This monument to corruption into a memorial for justice. Sylvia was ready. The memorial service began at 10 in the morning, under a clear autumn sky that painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. More than 200 people gathered at the mansion. Victims' families had traveled from across the country. Descendants of miners, workers, union organizers who disappeared into Harrison Whitlock's machinery of corruption. Some were elderly, remembering stories their grandparents had told. Others were younger, learning their family history for the first time. Trust descendants came too. Not all. Some families refused to acknowledge their ancestors' crimes, but enough. They stood separately at first, uncertain, carrying the weight of inherited shame. Media was present, but carefully controlled. Patricia had arranged for a single pool camera, with the understanding that this was about remembrance, not spectacle. The mansion itself had been transformed. The exterior was freshly painted, the grounds cleared and landscaped. Inside, the memorial wall gleamed. 47 names engraved in dark granite, each with dates and brief descriptions. Thomas Pritchard, 1888-1922, mine worker, union organizer, murdered for demanding safety. State police maintained a perimeter. Agent Cordova was present, along with federal marshals. Douglas was under house arrest in Helena, but his associates were still at large. And tensions remained high. Vernon spoke first, standing before the assembled crowd with quiet dignity. My grandfather was Hiram Kemp, sheriff of this county for 28 years. Growing up, I heard stories about him. A lawman who kept the peace, maintained order, served justice. Those stories were lies. His voice was steady but emotional. Hiram Kemp was a murderer. He participated in the killing of Harrison and James Whitlock. He covered up dozens of other crimes. He took bribes to look the other way, while working people suffered and died. He paused, looking at the memorial wall. I cannot undo what he did, but I can acknowledge it. I can say clearly what he did was wrong. The victims deserved justice. Their families deserved truth. And I'm grateful more than I can express. That truth has finally come to light. Patricia spoke next, her voice breaking slightly as she acknowledged her great-grandfather's role as mine superintendent, his complicity in safety violations that killed workers, his participation in the trust's operations. Then came the victims' families. An elderly woman stepped forward, Thomas Pritchard's great-granddaughter, now 83, who'd flown from Oregon. Her name was Dorothy, and she carried a photograph of Thomas in his miner's clothes, badge 247 pinned to his shirt. I never knew my great-grandfather, she said, her voice thin but clear. He disappeared before my grandmother was born. She grew up believing he'd abandoned the family, that he was a coward who ran away. She carried that shame her whole life. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Now we know the truth. He didn't abandon anyone. He was murdered because he stood up for his fellow workers, because he demanded basic safety and dignity. She placed the photograph next to Thomas's name on the memorial wall. Thank you, she said, turning to Sylvia. Thank you for giving him back his honor. Others followed, descendants sharing stories, placing flowers and photographs, reclaiming their ancestors' names from decades of silence and lies. The ceremony moved to the cemetery where Harrison and James would be buried. The stone angels stood watch as their coffins, simple pine, respectful but not elaborate, were lowered into the ground they'd occupied secretly for a century. A local minister, who'd agreed to perform the service despite controversy, spoke about mercy and justice, about the complexity of human nature, about the importance of truth even when it's painful. Harrison Whitlock was both victim and victimizer, the minister said. He built an empire on suffering, yet in his final days sought redemption through truth. We cannot forgive what he did, but we can acknowledge his final act, documenting the evidence that has brought justice to those he wronged. James Whitlock was innocent, a young man who died for his father's sins. We honor his memory by remembering that corruption destroys not just its victims, but the families of its perpetrators. As the coffins settled into the earth, Sylvia felt the weight of the moment. 6 months of investigation, danger, and revelation had led here to this acknowledgement, this public reckoning with truth. Then the sound of vehicles approaching broke the solemnity. 3 black SUVs came up the drive, moving fast. They stopped at the police perimeter, and men in suits climbed out. Douglas Whitlock's attorneys, accompanied by private security. The lead attorney approached the state police commander. We have a court order. Mr. Whitlock's house arrest has been modified. He's permitted to attend his great-grandfather's burial. Cordova stepped forward. Let me see that order. She reviewed the document, her expression darkening. This was issued 20 minutes ago by Judge Whitmore. Who has full authority in this matter? The attorney interrupted smoothly. Judge Whitmore is under investigation for connections to trust operations, Cordova said coldly. This order is suspect. Nevertheless, it's valid until challenged. My client has a right to attend his ancestor's funeral. From the lead SUV, Douglas emerged. He wore a dark suit and an ankle monitor visible beneath his pant leg. His expression was hard, angry, focused entirely on Sylvia. The crowd shifted uneasily. Vernon moved closer to Sylvia, protective. Sam and Jean positioned themselves nearby. Douglas walked slowly toward the cemetery, his attorneys flanking him. He stopped at the grave where Harrison and James were being buried. For a long moment, he stood in silence. Then he turned to face Sylvia directly. "You've destroyed everything," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet gathering. 5 generations of my family's work, businesses that employed thousands, a legacy of building and progress, all of it ruined because you couldn't leave the past buried. Sylvia met his gaze steadily. Your legacy was built on murder, ancient history. Sins committed by men long dead, history that continued, corruption that continued. You weren't protecting your great-grandfather's reputation. You were protecting your own criminal enterprise. Douglas's face flushed with anger. You have no idea what you're talking about. The trust built this valley. We created prosperity, opportunity. You created suffering, Dorothy interrupted, stepping forward with Thomas Pritchard's photograph. My great-grandfather died in your family's cold room. Your great-grandfather murdered him because he asked for safe working conditions. Other descendants moved forward, forming a line between Douglas and the graves. One by one, they spoke their ancestors' names. The murdered, the silenced, the erased. Douglas looked at them, at the memorial wall, at the crowd of people who'd come to bear witness. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, recognition, perhaps, of the true cost of his family's empire. Then his mask of anger returned. This isn't over. My attorneys will fight every charge, will appeal every ruling. The Whitlock family doesn't lose. You already lost, Sylvia said quietly. The truth is out. Everyone knows now. You can fight in court for years, but you can't put the truth back in the ground. Agent Cordova stepped forward. Mr. Whitlock, your permitted time is finished. Return to your vehicle. Douglas stood his ground for a moment longer, staring at Sylvia with undisguised hatred. Then he turned and walked back to the SUV, his attorneys following. As the vehicles departed, the crowd seemed to exhale collectively. The burial service continued, now with renewed purpose. Earth was shoveled onto the coffins, covering them finally properly, with full knowledge of who lay beneath and what their lives had meant. When it was finished, people gathered at the mansion for a reception Patricia had organized. Coffee, simple food, conversation. The atmosphere shifted from somber remembrance to something else, determination, perhaps, or hope. Sylvia found herself surrounded by victims' families, all of them thanking her, sharing stories, expressing gratitude that someone had finally cared enough to uncover the truth. Vernon touched her shoulder. You did it. You actually did it. We did it, Sylvia corrected. All of us together. But even as she spoke, she knew the fight wasn't over. Douglas's appearance had been a reminder. Powerful people don't surrender easily. The legal battles ahead would be long, expensive, exhausting. Still, standing in the mansion she'd bought for $1, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by truth, Sylvia felt the rightness of what they'd accomplished. The dead had been honored. The truth had been told. Justice, however imperfect, was being pursued, and the mansion was no longer a place of secrets. It was becoming something better, a place of memory, education, and hope that the mistakes of the past might prevent future wrongs. The preliminary hearings began 2 weeks later in the federal courthouse in Missoula. Sylvia sat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Vernon and Patricia. Behind them, the courtroom was packed. Media, victims' families, curious citizens, and a contingent of Douglas's supporters who glared at anyone associated with the prosecution. Douglas entered in a tailored suit, flanked by 3 attorneys, whose hourly rates probably exceeded what Sylvia had earned in a year. He looked composed, confident, showing none of the anger he'd displayed at the memorial service. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Agent Cordova took the stand first, walking the court through the evidence, Harrison's ledgers, the trust documents, the modern financial records showing continued criminal activity. She explained how Whitlock Holdings LLC was the direct successor to the trust, how shell companies and offshore accounts had been used to launder money, evade taxes and maintain control over regional industries. The paper trail was extensive, carefully documented, undeniable. Defense attorneys objected repeatedly, challenging chain of custody, questioning authentication, demanding proof that their client had direct knowledge of criminal activity. But Harrison's notarized affidavit, filed with a federal clerk in 1923 and never investigated, established historical continuity. The ledgers showed an unbroken line from the trust's founding to Whitlock Holdings' current operations. On the third day, Sheriff Brennan testified. He was a broken man, his career destroyed, his reputation ruined, facing significant prison time. But his testimony was thorough and damning. Douglas Whitlock knew everything, Brennan said, his voice flat. He showed me the trust ledgers when he recruited me 15 years ago. He said I was joining a tradition, that my great-grandfather had been part of it, that this was how the valley really worked. He paid me $50,000 a year to ignore certain complaints, to make sure certain investigations went nowhere. What kind of investigations? The prosecutor asked. Labor violations at Whitlock's timber operations, safety complaints at the mines he still owns, environmental citations, anything that might hurt his businesses or expose the network. Brennan looked directly at Douglas. He told me it was what my great-grandfather did for his great-grandfather. Family tradition. The defense cross-examination was brutal, trying to paint Brennan as a liar seeking reduced sentencing. But financial records corroborated his testimony. Regular payments from Whitlock Holdings to accounts Brennan controlled. Other witnesses followed. Accountants testified about fraudulent tax filings. Mine workers described safety violations and threats when they complained. Former employees of Whitlock Holdings spoke about document destruction, intimidation tactics, evidence of ongoing corruption. Patricia testified about finding the historical records, explaining their significance. Vernon testified about the break-in at the mansion, about Douglas's threats. Sam testified about attempts to intimidate Sylvia through building code harassment. Then Sylvia took the stand. She walked the court through her entire journey, buying the mansion, finding the vault, discovering the ledgers, uncovering the cold room, locating Harrison's confession. She spoke calmly, factually, letting the evidence speak for itself. The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony, suggesting she'd fabricated evidence, that her research was biased, that she had financial motives for sensationalizing historical events. Ms. Dornan, isn't it true you've received substantial funding from a historical preservation foundation? Yes, to restore the mansion and create an educational center. And doesn't that give you incentive to exaggerate the historical significance of what you found? The evidence speaks for itself. I didn't exaggerate anything. I documented what was there. But you had everything to gain from making sensational claims. I had everything to lose. Sylvia interrupted quietly. I bought that house looking for a home. What I found instead was responsibility, danger, threat. People broke into my home. Your client threatened me personally. If I wanted an easy life, I could have walked away with $50,000 and let the past stay buried. Yet you chose to proceed. I chose to tell the truth. Because Thomas Pritchard and 46 others deserved to have their stories told. Because corruption doesn't disappear if we ignore it. Because doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. The defense attorney tried several more approaches, but Sylvia remained steady, her testimony consistent with all the documented evidence. After 2 hours, the judge called for a break. In the hallway, Dorothy found Sylvia. The elderly woman embraced her, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. Thank you for standing up there and speaking for my great-grandfather. For all of them. Other family members gathered around, descendants of the murdered, the silenced, the erased. They'd been sitting in the gallery day after day, bearing witness. finally seeing their ancestors' suffering acknowledged in a court of law. When testimony resumed, the prosecution called its final witness, a forensic accountant who'd analyzed Whitlock Holdings' finances. His testimony was technical but clear. The company had systematically evaded taxes, laundered money through shell corporations, and maintained the same corrupt practices the trust had pioneered a century earlier. The structure is remarkably consistent, the accountant explained. Same techniques, same patterns, just updated for modern banking systems. It's as if someone kept the original playbook and simply adapted it for each generation. The defense rested without calling Douglas to testify. Too risky, given the weight of evidence against him. Instead, they argued that their client was being persecuted for his ancestors' sins, that legitimate business practices were being mischaracterized as criminal activity, that the prosecution was politically motivated, but the judge wasn't swayed. After reviewing all evidence, he ruled that there was sufficient cause for trial on all charges: conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, obstruction, witness intimidation. Douglas would face a jury. Bond was revoked. The judge cited Douglas's attempts to intimidate witnesses, his violations of house arrest conditions, his family's demonstrated history of eliminating threats. Douglas was remanded to federal custody pending trial. As marshals led him away, Douglas looked back at Sylvia one last time. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, but so was something else: defeat. The recognition that his family's century of impunity was finally ending. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed the prosecution team. Cordova gave a brief statement, emphasizing that justice was being served, that no one was above the law, that historical crimes cast long shadows that must be confronted. Sylvia declined to speak to reporters. She'd said everything that mattered on the witness stand. Vernon drove her back to the mansion as sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and rose. They rode in comfortable silence, both exhausted from days of testimony and emotional intensity. "It's really over," Vernon said finally. "The hearings, anyway. The trial will take months, but he's finished. Everyone knows what he did, what his family did." "It's not quite over," Sylvia replied. "There's still the trial. And even after conviction, there's the work of remembering, educating, making sure this history doesn't get forgotten again. But the hard part's done. You exposed the truth. You stood up in court and made sure the victims were heard." Sylvia touched the compass in her pocket, thinking about her father, about the path that had led her to this moment. "The hard part is living with the truth once you know it. That's the work that never ends." They pulled up to the mansion as the last light faded from the sky. The building stood solid against the darkening mountains, no longer haunted by secrets. Finally, at peace with its own history, Sylvia climbed out of the truck and stood looking at the house that had changed her life. In 6 months, she'd gone from an isolated woman in a mountain cabin to someone who'd helped bring down a criminal empire and give voice to a century of silenced victims. The mansion had given her purpose, and she'd given it redemption. Inside, the lights were on. Sam had been working on final details for the educational center's opening next month. The memorial wall was complete, the archive organized, the cold room preserved as testimony. Tomorrow, Sylvia would return to the daily work of restoration and remembrance. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel what she'd accomplished: justice, truth, and the peace that comes from following your compass true, no matter how difficult the journey. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, the Whitlock Truth and Reconciliation Center opened its doors to the public. The mansion had been completely transformed. The exterior gleamed with fresh paint in historically accurate colors, deep burgundy with cream trim. The gardens, once overgrown and wild, now featured native plants and peaceful walking paths. A new sign at the entrance, crafted from local timber, bore the center's name and its mission: remembering the past, learning for the future. The crowd gathering for the opening was smaller than the memorial service had been, but no less meaningful. Victims' families had returned, some traveling across the country. Trust descendants came too, those who'd chosen acknowledgement over denial, healing over hiding. Local residents, students, historians and educators filled the grounds. The media presence was respectful, focused on the center's educational mission rather than sensationalism. The documentary about the case had premiered the previous month, receiving critical acclaim for its balanced approach to difficult history. A book was forthcoming, authored by Patricia with contributions from victims' families. Douglas's trial had concluded in February. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury had deliberated for only 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. He'd been sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. 6 of his associates had accepted plea deals, receiving shorter sentences in exchange for testimony and cooperation in recovering hidden assets. The recovered funds, tens of millions of dollars, were being distributed to victims' families and used to establish community programs. Some money went to improve mine safety regulations across the region. More funded scholarships for descendants of workers who'd suffered under the trust's operations. The mansion itself had been permanently protected. Sylvia had worked with the Historical Preservation Foundation to establish a conservation easement, ensuring the property could never be sold or developed. It would remain a center for education and remembrance in perpetuity. Patricia spoke first at the opening ceremony, standing in the main hall where the memorial wall now anchored the space. "This building represents a choice," she said, her voice steady. "Every community faces a choice about how to remember difficult history. We can bury it, deny it, minimize it, or we can acknowledge it honestly, learn from it and commit to doing better." She gestured to the memorial wall, where 47 names gleamed in the morning light. These people, Thomas Pritchard, Anne Whitlock, and so many others, they deserve to be remembered. Not as abstract historical figures, but as real people who suffered, who fought for dignity, who were silenced by power that refused accountability. Vernon spoke next, his words reflecting the journey he'd traveled from shame to action. "My grandfather participated in terrible crimes. I can't change that. But I can refuse to let those crimes be forgotten. I can work to make sure future generations understand how corruption operates, how power can be abused, and why ordinary people must have the courage to speak truth, even when it's dangerous." He announced that the Kemp Family Foundation had committed $500,000 to the center's endowment, ensuring ongoing operations and educational programming. Patricia's family had done the same. Other trust descendants had made similar commitments, turning their ancestors' ill-gotten wealth toward justice and education. Dorothy, Thomas Pritchard's great-granddaughter, spoke briefly but powerfully. "For 90 years my family carried shame. We believed Thomas abandoned us, that he was a coward who ran away. Learning the truth was painful. He was murdered, tortured, because he stood up for his fellow workers. But knowing the truth also freed us from false shame. He was a hero, not a coward. And now everyone will know that." She placed a single rose at Thomas's name on the memorial wall, and others followed, family members honoring their ancestors with flowers, photographs and quiet tears. Then Sylvia spoke, standing in the entry hall where she'd first walked 6 months earlier, expecting nothing more than a renovation project. "When I bought this house for $1, I was looking for a place to belong. What I found instead was a responsibility I never anticipated." She looked around at the transformed space, at the people gathered. This mansion held secrets for a century, terrible secrets about corruption, murder, and suffering. But it also held something else, evidence, truth, the possibility of justice, however delayed. She pulled her father's compass from her pocket, holding it so the light caught its worn brass surface. "My father taught me that doing what's right isn't always easy. Sometimes the path is hard, dangerous, lonely. But a compass only works if you're willing to follow it, even when you're afraid. This center exists because people had the courage to follow that compass. Vernon, who faced his grandfather's crimes honestly. Patricia, who chose truth over comfortable denial. Sam and Jean, who worked tirelessly to transform this building. Agent Cordova, and law enforcement who pursued justice despite obstacles, and the families of victims who waited decades for acknowledgement and never gave up hope. She gestured to the rooms around them, the preserved cold room with its memorial plaques, the archive with Harrison's ledgers, the educational displays showing how corruption operates and how communities can fight it. The treasure in this house was never the gold coins I found. It was the truth. And what we choose to do with truth determines whether we repeat the mistakes of the past or learn from them. After the ceremony, people toured the center in small groups. Docents, trained by Patricia, guided them through the exhibits, explaining the history thoughtfully, connecting past to present, showing how the lessons applied to contemporary issues of power, justice, and accountability. Sylvia walked through the room slowly, observing visitors' reactions. Some were moved to tears at the memorial wall. Others were fascinated by the archive, reading through copies of the trust ledgers, seeing how systematic corruption operates. Students took notes, teachers asked questions, victims' families shared stories. In Anne Whitlock's preserved closet, a young woman stood reading excerpts from the diary displayed behind glass. "She tried to leave," the woman said to her companion. "She knew what was happening was wrong, and she tried to escape. That took courage, but she didn't make it," her companion replied. "No, but her diary survived. Her truth survived. That means something." That evening, after the crowds had departed, Sylvia stood alone in the master bedroom, where Anne's closet had been hidden for so long. The daguerreotype of Harrison, Anne, and young James hung on the wall now, no longer concealed, but displayed with full historical context. "Your story's been told," Sylvia said quietly to the photograph. "All of your stories. The good and the terrible, the love and the cruelty. Everything." She walked downstairs to the library, which had been converted into her private quarters. The room was comfortable now, furnished simply, with books lining the shelves and a desk where she worked on the center's operations. On the desk sat James's restored pocket watch beside her father's compass. 2 timepieces, 2 legacies, both marking the passage of time and the possibility of redemption through truth. Vernon arrived with dinner, a habit they'd developed over the months of working together. Patricia joined them, then Sam and Jean. The 5 of them gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where Sylvia had first opened Harrison's ledger and begun this journey. They talked about the day, about visitors' reactions, about upcoming school tours and research requests. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind that comes from shared purpose and mutual respect. "What you've built here," Jean said, gesturing around the restored kitchen, "it's remarkable. You took something dark and made it into something that serves the light." "We built it together," Sylvia corrected. "None of this would exist without all of us." "But you started it," Vernon insisted. "You could have walked away after finding the gold coins. Could have sold to Douglas, taken the money, avoided all the danger and hardship. But you didn't." "I couldn't," Sylvia said simply. "Once I knew the truth, I couldn't unknow it. And once you know, you have a responsibility to act." After they left, Sylvia walked through the mansion one final time before bed. The building felt different now, no longer haunted by secrets, no longer weighted with silence. It felt purposeful, alive with the possibility of teaching and learning. She climbed to the attic office, where Harrison's desk still sat beneath the dormer window. The space had been preserved as part of the archive, showing visitors where the evidence had been hidden, where truth had waited for someone brave enough to find it. Sylvia opened her journal she'd been documenting the entire experience for future visitors, and wrote a final entry. "I bought this house for $1. I paid for it with 6 months of fear, hard work, and determination. But what I gained was priceless: purpose, community, and the knowledge that one person can make a difference. The treasure was never in the vaults or the gold. It was in the truth and in what we chose to do with it. In choosing justice over comfort, courage over fear, remembrance over forgetting. This mansion was meant to be a monument to power and wealth. Instead, it became a testament to the power of truth. And that's worth more than any fortune." She closed the journal and stood at the window, looking out over the valley. Lights from distant homes dotted the mountainside. The same valley that had suffered under the trust's corruption, that had carried the weight of buried secrets for a century, was healing now. Not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. The legal cases would continue for years. Some families would never acknowledge their ancestors' crimes. The economic impact of exposing corruption had been real and painful, but the valley was facing its history honestly, learning from it, choosing a different future, and the mansion, her home now, truly stood as a promise that truth matters, that justice matters, that ordinary people can stand against power and win. Sylvia descended the stairs to her quarters, passing the memorial wall where 47 names gleamed softly in the evening light. She touched Thomas Pritchard's name gently. "Rest easy," she whispered. "You're remembered now. All of you." In her room, she placed her father's compass on the nightstand beside James's pocket watch. Both had guided her here, one pointing toward true north, the other marking time that had finally caught up with justice. She opened her window, letting the mountain air flow through. Outside, the spring night was alive with sounds, wind in the pines, a distant owl, the creek running high with snowmelt. For the first time since buying the mansion, Sylvia felt completely at peace. Not the peace of forgetting or ignoring, but the peace of knowing you've done what needed doing. The peace of following your compass true, even through difficult terrain, and arriving at a destination that matters. She climbed into bed and closed her eyes. Holding that peace close, the mansion had cost her $1, but it had given her everything that truly mattered: purpose, courage, belonging, and the profound satisfaction of turning darkness into light. In the morning, there would be more work. School groups to tour, researchers to assist, stories to tell. The work of remembering and teaching never ends. But tonight, Sylvia Dornan slept peacefully in the mansion that had chosen her just as surely as she'd chosen it. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the gardens, carrying the scent of new growth and possibility, and the old house, no longer a keeper of secrets, but a teller of truths, stood solid and strong against the stars. Finally at peace with its history and its purpose,